I think
movement.
the main movement is the Ledros Control deck of I remember me and Anton were saying last week. So we evaluated originally as B tier, but we're like, this deck's kind of a little bit of a sleeper deck here. We were thinking that it was gonna make a bit of a return to the meta because the main thing that was pushing it out of the meta before was Lux Karma, and that's not a deck anymore. Nobody plays that deck whatsoever because the Ionia cards are pretty strong against this. Deny specifically, and then Unyielding Spirit in combination with just really high value cards, resilient threats. It's kind of everything that this deck didn't want to deal with
Right.
is all in one deck. So now that that's not really in the meta, Anton was already of the opinion that this deck was much better than B tier, and I was on the fence, but I was like, I think it's at least A tier, but I was thinking more towards the bottom of A tier. But then after playing this a lot through the week, I would say Anton really pushed for it, and we're like, all right, Anton, well, here you are. We'll try this deck out, and we definitely ate our words on this being a B tier. Anton was like, "Let me show the boys what's up." We gave it a good try, and I'm pushing towards the top of A tier with
Yeah.
this deck now. I think this deck is extremely powerful in the current metagame. It's definitely a couple main reasons why. The Ledros Atrocity win condition is just always going to be good, especially when there's just not that many Ionia decks that are being played right now. The only one is just Heimerdinger. That's really the only thing, and you have actually just so many ways to kill the Heimerdinger in this deck that you have a pretty reasonable time managing everything that Heimerdinger can do. Just your auto win condition is a little bit harder to do, but against everything else, Ledros Atrocity, very powerful, and Ruination and Vengeance are the other two big ones of just being very good against these mid-rangey, high statted decks that we're playing against right now. A lot of board-based decks.
Yeah, tons and tons of board-based decks. It really originally started with me just wanting to find a way to play Runations in the format because I felt like it was very good. We tried playing with Undying and a bunch of other junk. Ultimately, I was just like, well, is this Karina deck still very good? Played the original list. Brood Awakening sucked. Definitely wanted to get rid of that. But
For sure.
started really getting into Gotcha because we needed more ways to deal 3. And it also just lined up really well with what was going on in the format right now. People are playing either MF or they're either playing MF or Callista on 3 most of the time in the two big S tier decks that are seeing play all day. And usually if you're missing your Aristocrat on 1 and you're not thermal beaming a 1-drop, then you're dropping Elise on 2, and then on 3 you have that Gotcha there dealing 3 to either of those champions and killing them. Pretty nice way to curve without having to shoot it with a Get Excited and discard a card. And that's really where this deck can fall behind if you have to use a lot of Get Exciteds early on to answer things. You're not generating a lot of card advantage, so it's harder for us. And the boys did add in the Chump Wump package, which did mitigate that quite a bit, as well as just give us a really good tool in the form of Chump Wump to remove things in the early game, and also just something that deals 4 is really relevant versus all the 4 health things and 3 health things in the format right now. It's also just able to just be a behemoth of a wall versus things like Crimson Disciple. Anything that's a 2/3 or a 1/1 just can't even attack once you have a Chump Wump developed on the board. So very good card. Also, the Mushroom Clouds can be used either as discard fodder or as burn, and you do want to get that 1 point of burn on your opponent so that Ledros is able to come down and 1-2 punch them with the Atrocity. Though Ledros alone is also just enough to get there a lot of times. He's just a win condition on himself. Atrocity is definitely just a card that pushes him way over the top. But as we've talked about many times before, this card going to 9 mana really didn't make it any less dumb than it is. It's still just a win condition on its own that eventually gets there, and it's really hard to answer. There's just not a lot of decks that can answer him once he starts coming down if they haven't already like pushed you to the point where you're almost dead.
Absolutely. Also, he just really fills in the curve to the Chump Wump edition of the fact that Brood Awakening, and we brought it up a couple times on stream of how Brood Awakening at 5 mana used to be you could play a card on turn 2, play a card on turn 3, whether that be like the Elise curve into something or, just whatever it used to be like Elise, Frenzied Skitter. You could play Brood Awakening as your turn 4 play easily by just skipping turn 1. And now it doesn't really pan out that way. A lot of times also you could go like Aristocrat, play, something on 2, play another 2 on 2, play a 3 Just depending on how the curve really pans out. You can't actually play the Brood Awakening as early as you would have liked to now, and it used to be fit in very well on turn 4, and now we're really lacking a nice turn 4 play to just curve out. And Chump Wump is just the perfect way to do it. Just the 4/3 body, as Anton was saying, 4 damage in this deck. Very powerful. It's just a strong trading tool, and then all that overlapping value. But
Yeah,
the
Heimer had such a hard time dealing with it on 3 too, because you would have the 6 mana on 3, you'd be able to cast it and still save one, and then on 4 you could cast the second one. And then that was just like, oh shit, they have three 3/1s and 3 2/1s, and I'm Heimer, like, how do I deal with this on turn 4? Like, yeah, they have 6 bodies on the board.
Right, yeah, it was the Brood Awakening used to just be crushing, and now that card is just really pretty mediocre, like, overall, of just costs too much mana, gets answered a little too easily in the current metagame with Make It Rains everywhere, and,
Yep.
like, it's really bad against Misfortune. That's another huge reason why it's like you wanna play the Brood Awakening against the more aggressive decks to buy you some time, and it actually just didn't buy you any time against the most popular aggro deck. It's so,
Right.
it's not very good, and Chump Wump kinda just trades against everything in that deck, so it's been working out pretty well. I think the big reasons to play deck was Vengeance and Ruination. Just very powerful
Oh yeah,
answers.
vengeance
Vengeance
huge.
kills Heimerdinger through any amount of healing or barrier. They have to have exactly deny, which a lot of times they don't play their Heimerdinger with exactly deny. And even if they don't, we don't have Vengeance. There's so many ways to just kill the card. Ruination, all these board-based decks against MF Sejuani, if you drop the turn 6 Ruination, it's lights out, the game's over. Even against Deep, when they commit a lot to their board with these huge guys, Ruination, not really that difficult as long as you don't get Maokai and your deck gets obliterated. So
Right.
it's very good lately. It's just been performing very well on ladder.
What do you think is keeping Ledros Control out of an S tier conversation?
Probably
Um,
just the consistency issues of the win condition, maybe, as well as just the fact that just how the curves can pan out sometimes. I shouldn't even say the consistency issues, but like you can sometimes just draw hands that don't line up with what's going on your opponent's side of the board when they high roll those games. I think it can sometimes struggle a little bit.
right. Some of the high roll situations are definitely hard to deal with. I think that it's funny because I feel like it has a very good matchup versus most of what we put into S tier, but then it struggles with clunky hands versus a lot of A tier stuff and below, just because it was built originally because these cards line up so well versus the S tier, but then it loses to a lot of, I feel like it maybe not loses to, but it just doesn't have a great matchup against anything in particular. It's just doing a solid thing on its own.
Yeah, I think like the endure high roll hands are a little hard to beat.
So nuts.
Um, it doesn't outright just beat Heimerdinger. I think that you're slightly favored against Heimerdinger with this deck, especially if they've been kind of savvy enough to not play the 2 denies anymore, because this is kind of the only deck that denies really strong against right now. That I would
Yes.
say, and maybe the deep deck as well. But other than those two, it's so bad against just about everything in the meta that's actually popular right now. And the other one I would say is probably the what is it? The potential for kind of just value based decks. Again, it's more the high roll hands of those value based decks of things that are just playing the plunder packs, stealing your Ledros, and like stealing other high value cards of just like they just draw too many cards sometimes for you to effectively answer everything. Um, but it's not even quite as straightforward as like they just draw too many cards. We can lose the game sometimes. It's more they can draw too many cards and it just becomes more difficult than it needs to be, especially playing around your own cards with the plunder packs. And if they steal Ledros, and it's happened to us before, or even like just Karina or Vengeance and a Ruination and things like that, sometimes it just becomes a problem.
I had a opponent drop a turn 8 Ledros on me that he stole, and then atrocity me after with the second card he stole. So that was a rough
Just
one.
goes to show you, you should play a worse deck to play around that.
That is the bad side about playing Ledros and Atrocity. They are both non-champion cards, so they can be plundered and used against you for the 1/2.
So, what are some upcoming changes in this deck that you might anticipate? What are some flex spots that we could see maybe played around depending on what becomes popular, what emerges as some of the front runners of the upcoming format?
I think that we have a lot of flex spots in here. Withering Whale's still a consideration. It is a good card versus certain board states, especially like the Endure decks. It does feel really good versus when they're playing Curse Keeper, being able to kill both things and the Curse Keeper itself, and just gain 3 health is very good. Gaining health in general is just something that we've kind of lost going into this version of the deck, and I do feel like after playing against Burn a couple of times, after trimming some Vile Feast and getting rid of Whales, I did feel like, man, there were a few games where I was like, man, I really wish we had a couple more heal cards in here. Maybe we do need to go back up to 3 grasps. I think Nick was talking about that the other day. How maybe we do just still want a third one of that as well. It is just a very powerful card, and healing really helps. But yeah, there's just a lot. The deck is really tight, and there's a lot of little flex spots we can put in. I think we talked about even trying Dead Bloom Wanderer potentially. I did test it a little bit. It did feel strong. Elise does have certain board states, especially like versus the MF Sedge deck, where she's okay. Like if you play her, they start with Omen Hawk and they don't have really anything to do on 2. She feels decent. Because like the 1/1 will just kill Omen Hawk. She gets in for 2. It's important to deal 1 point of damage, as we said. But overall, she just doesn't feel that impressive later game. Maybe something like Wanderer might be better, or maybe we even just start looking into putting additional Karinas in. But it does feel like we are already playing a lot of 9 drops. There's just a lot of instances in which I'd like additional copies of these cards, but maybe that is just because we're playing the toolbox variant of the list. If anything, though, I would say more heal. That's where I'm looking at Deadbloom Wanderer or Whales, somewhere in there, just trying it out.
Yeah, I'm very for the Dead Bloom Wanderer. That's definitely the next card on the testing list for sure. After making this, it definitely has felt like Elise has been a bit underwhelming in the early game these days. I go back and forth on whether I like Whale, but I think it's just the healing. I feel like it's kind of it's kind of a suboptimal card in comparison to Static Shock. With that 3 heal, you're right. Of sometimes it does feel like we've trimmed the healing to be more consistent against a broader variety of decks. And I think Grasp is still fine because 3 damage answers a lot of good cards in the meta. But if we could find an alternative to Whale for the healing slot, I'm very on board with something like Dead Bloom Wanderer. I think the 3 damage cards are usually just a lot more effective right now than the dealing of damage to the board.
Right.
But I
Except
completely
versus
agree
Heimer.
that healing, right? Heimer, it definitely matters. But even Dead Bloom Wanderer against Heimer is really strong.
For
We
sure.
do maybe I feel like Static Shock is usually just better against them just for the mana cost. But I think we have a pretty good chance of beating Heimer as long as we find Vengeance. That's probably the big one of just making sure that we have a way to kill Heimerdinger that our opponent cannot easily respond to. I'd almost consider like hard mulling for Vengeance when I play Heimerdinger. Honestly, it just seems like such a crucial card to have. That Vi, like the cards that are just hard to answer,
Oh yeah.
hard to counter answers to Heimerdinger, I would say.
Yeah, Vi versus like almost every mid range just feels great in this deck as a keep.
Oh yeah. Especially with the attack token on 5, she's still just a powerhouse. She's
Oh
really
yeah.
she feels like the glue that holds the whole deck together, that lets you coast through the mid game until you get to your extremely heavy stabilization turns where you pop off on Ruinations or drop, Karina or Ledros and just start, getting your 9 drops online, and the game kind of just ends there.
Yep.
So, Withering Whale and to a lesser extent Vile Feast have seemed very expendable lately. Why do you think that is?
The amount of burst speed, combat tricks that are currently seeing play, I'd say, is a big part of it. We're seeing a lot. We have the Noxus Ionia list, for instance, now playing triple disciplines. We've got Heimer playing triple disciplines. All of these Freljord decks, which we see are 2 of our S tier decks, are Freljord, have access to Fury of the North and Elixir of Iron. I feel like dealing 1 damage is just something that people can just heal above and beyond now, and it just isn't doing quite what it needs to do. The 1 mana 1/1 blocker is still relevant, right? To stop like a Yeti attack or just a 5/5 or something occasionally. It does get you there, and it's nice to be able to deal 1 versus Heimer as well. Usually Vile Feast is able to, stop an early lethal turn or something that would just do a little bit too much damage early on. But I feel like overall the amount of times that dealing 1, as Nick said, like dealing 1 to the board just doesn't feel really good. Even Static Shock at least it replaces itself, but it still doesn't even feel great most of the time. But there are those certain matchups where dealing 1 feels so good that you do need some of these cards. It's just a matter of which ones we need and where on curve that we need them, and figuring that out depending on what other cards we're adding in. Like if we're adding Wanderer on 3, that changes our mana curve because, unlike Demacia decks, and I talked about this a little bit in the guide for this that's coming up, is just like a lot of people don't look at your mana curve of what you're playing with your spell mana when you're thinking of things like that. Like I said, even something as like gotcha being okay, well, I want to play this on 3 to answer most 3 health things. What can I do before turn 3 that allows me to still play this consistently on 3? Okay, well, I can Aristocrat, or I can Elise, or I can Thermo Beam like on 1 or 2. No, you can't. You can Thermo Beam on 2. You wouldn't be able to Thermo Beam. No, you wouldn't be able to Thermo Beam.
You'd be able to
right?
thermo beam on 1, and then
Just on
and then
1.
gotcha
Yeah.
on 3.
So
right?
yeah.
Yeah.
So
Or
like
Vile
things
Feast
like
on
that.
2,
Yeah.
and then
Things
gotcha
like
on
that.
3,
You need to be able to. You need to be able to identify where in your mana curve your early game is going to work out, because really the early game and the mid game is where you need to navigate. Then Ledros just lets you catch up after that on everything else.
I completely agree. Once you get to that, navigate to your big power plays in the late game, it's pretty smooth sailing. But all the 1 HP cards kind of suck right now, like in terms of targets. Like, what are we going to kill? Like Omen Hawk, Blighted Caretaker, like cards that already got a lot of value. And as you said, there's just infinite counters to dealing a damage. Even like one of the biggest reasons to play this card before was A, the burn matchup, and B, the Demacia matchup, because you could kill the 4/1 Grizzled Ranger and then block the 4/4 Bear afterwards.
Right.
And those cards aren't A, don't deal as much damage anymore, aren't as threatening, and B, aren't even very popular in the metagame right now. So just feels like it can burn you out of resources very fast if you're playing cards like Vile Feast. And that was one of the cards that I was considering cutting for the Dead Bloom Wanderer for sure, because it's like, we can't lose that heal. That Vile Feast is kind of a necessary evil of, like, as Nathan said, like, you just got to get through that early and mid game. It's can sometimes be a crucial part of that. And I think Dead Bloom Wanderer can do a very similar job to the Vile Feast in the early game, but have a little bit more reach on what it can actually answer in the current metagame.
Vengeance is a card that's severely underrated in my opinion. I think all 3 of us feel very strongly about the strength of Vengeance. Why do you think Vengeance is strong, and then why do you think people are dismissive of it?
I'm not sure why people are being extremely dismissive, but as far as why it's strong, I mean, it's essentially this deck's. We've mentioned why Ionia is so powerful. One of the biggest reasons is Will of Ionia. This is definitely a more expensive version of doing something like that, but rather than, of course, sending it back to hand, you are killing it. But in response to how strong Atrocity is, like, it's very clear that Atrocity is a very powerful card. We're talking about this deck potentially being top of A tier, pushing into S tier. It has Atrocity in it. So does the They Who Endure deck. So do the deep decks. Like, all these decks are playing Atrocity because this card is just an insane amount of reach, and it allows you to play the game in just a different way. Your opponent turning your opponent's answers on your big threats, that there isn't very many ways to deal with big threats as it is. So if they happen to have a single answer for it, you're able to turn it into damage. The only way that really is able to answer those is a way to remove those cards, and Will of Ionia and Vengeance are really the only cards that do that. So Vengeance is just our version of being able to remove something. It's also just able to answer the biggest threats in the game right now, Sejuani, and it goes through buffs. Like we were just talking about, Vile Feast is so bad right now because there's all these buffs. You can't buff through Vengeance. You need Deny, or you just lose whatever I want you to lose. And that's just such a powerful effect to have at the ready.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think it's mostly just the way that the meta lines up right now, and people used to just see the card as too costly for the old meta game, where it kind of fell out of, like, it just wasn't good enough against decks like Lux Karma because it would just always get countered, or their cards just got too much value. Demacia was too fast. Burn was too fast. You know what I mean? These were the really popular decks, and it wasn't very good against those. And also, like, some of the old Klepto Yoink decks, it wasn't as good against because they didn't play as much threats. But like the most common Bilgewater deck right now is MF Sejuani, and there are big threats that you want to kill that they sink a lot of mana into, like the Razor Scale Hunter, sometimes even Citrus Courier. The Sejuani is obviously the number one. And then against Endure, it's like against Endure, that's probably the most popular deck right now, if I'm not Mistaken seems to be the thing that we see the most on ladder. Kills the Endure, and it kills the Endure in response to Atrocity on top of that. So I think it's very important to have something like that. And unlike Will of Ionia, it solves the problem. It's just gone. That's it. Like they don't just keep replaying it. You're not delaying the inevitable. It's just the card is dead. So potential for 3 for sure. We've talked about it a lot of how 2 Ruinations felt a bit better than 3 in terms of the clunkiness, but 3 Vengeance is probably going to come back into the scene.
Well said. Anything else you want to add about this deck before we went a little out of order, but we'll go back to what are usually we go from the S down to the A into the B, and then some other fringe decks. Anything more you want to say about Ledros before we move on?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. Just a very powerful deck, and I think that we're gonna see it continue to crush the ladder, and I'd be surprised if people don't start picking it up a little bit more.
Yeah, It's a deck that people are familiar with, so I think people are willing to go back.
Right.
Alright, and we're back, speaking of a deck we're familiar with, Heimer. Same old deck, nothing much has changed. We've been experimenting with the Concussive Palm for about a week now. We feel that a one-of copy is exactly where we need it to be. If we ever wanted to get a lot of value off of it, Solitary Monk is a neat interaction where you get to actually pick it back up and then it becomes a Concussive Palm again. Deny, obviously, as we talked about before, it is falling out of favor because of the prominence of burst spells in a lot of the top decks right now. But we still want one in case of emergency, other Ionia decks or other Heimerdinger decks. But for the most part, it's just the same good deck.
Right.
A lot of people have been asking about that Concussive Palm lately, and I will say that it's just felt very, very strong in the current metagame. I think it's past the testing phase. We've been quote unquote testing it for a while, but I think it's solidified its way into this list. It's just been performing very well as a one-of for sure.
Yeah, I think for me the only thing I'm debating is if we do start seeing the emergence of another Shadow Isles deck in the form of Ledros, we might just have to go back to the second Deny again. It would just really depend on how powerful that and how popular that becomes on ladder.
That was we actually, because Keg Control was so popular a while back. If anybody remembers us playing Heimerdinger about 3 weeks ago, I think it was. Keg Control was pretty popular back then. I think it was about 3 weeks ago. It's been so long since a lot of people were playing Keg, but Keg was so popular towards the beginning of the format that we actually opted to move to 3 denies just to make that matchup a lot easier, just because we need to negate Brood Awakening as well as Vengeance, as I said earlier, is the best way to kill a Heimerdinger, just because the only way to stop it is deny. There are no other viable answers other than just vomit your hand full of spells and hope that those turrets can ride you to victory after your Heimerdinger goes away. So I think Anton's spot on. If people kind of take our advice here and start playing a lot of Keg Control, we'll probably have to move back into the double deny. I'm not sure if it would be the second Refuge that we would cut or the Concussive Palms. Probably one of those two. Potentially even the Key Guardian. I would say it's probably one of those 3 cards, but Key Guardian's pretty good against that deck, so it kind of depends on everything that we're seeing in the metagame. But I've been very happy with that Concussive Palms versus all of these mid-rangey aggressive decks. Very good versus MF Sej to buy you some time in the mid game. It's just been very helpful on turn 4, where a lot of times, you play Monk on 3 and then you kind of not really sure what you want to do on turn 4. Turn 4 is always the awkward turn in Heimerdinger, where you have a lot of options of generally not great plays to make. I would say it's by far the weakest turn in the whole game for Heimerdinger is always turn 4, unless of course you completely miss on having anything to play on turn 2 and turn 3 because you got unlucky. But even when you have a well-constructed hand, turn 4 is usually that awkward turn where you're like, I probably just want to bank mana and then save for turn 5 if I've spent some mana in my early game. But it helps a lot with the aggro decks. And even against Endure, I've been really liking it of just, I target your Endure with a card that's not Will of Ionia, and then your opponent feels obligated to then play Atrocity to get their damage in that turn, while you can hold your Will of Ionia to then beat it afterwards. And Concussive Palm is really great for that, and also just pushing for that bit of extra damage. And as Matt said before, that interaction with Solitary Monk has been sick. It's actually happened way more than I thought it would. of you play Solitary Monk and you pick up the dragon off the board and it turns back into Concussive Palm. It's been pretty crazy, like how many times we've seen that work. I really just didn't think it would happen as much as it does.
So we definitely play this deck just about every single day on stream. What can we anticipate will be the answer to Heimer and Vi?
As far as you're saying, what Riot's gonna
Just
do,
like
or as
just
far
like a
as,
hard
the deck?
counter as far as deck construction.
I feel like Shadow Isles can be. I mean, if you just wanted to hard target this deck, I feel like Shadow Isles might be where it's at. The Shadow Isles, some kind of Karina list with just tons of removal, tons of ways to deal 3. You know, just max ways to clear the turrets and with whales and shocks and all kinds of stuff. I mean, I feel like you could make it really, really rough for this deck to ever win against that list, but then you would be sacrificing in its place, the fine tuning versus your other matchups. I'm not sure what Nick feels.
I was actually thinking about this the other day, and I think it's a pretty unorthodox way to counter the Heimerdinger matchup, but I actually think that Swain Shadow Isles Control might be like one of the best ways to deal with Heimerdinger that doesn't make you just hard lose to a lot of these other matchups, just because it has all of the best answers to Heimerdinger that aren't easily counterable. So cards like Vengeance, Culling Strike, the Ravenous Flock, there's just a lot of good ways that deck can kill the Heimerdinger that aren't just stopped by like everything in the deck. So there's a bunch of great 3 damage cards, for example, in the game that people use to target our Heimerdinger often when we play. And even just like over, mana synced thermogenic beams just to stop the Twin Disciplines and plays like that. But then we still just find answers in the form of, things like Spirit's Refuge. We still have Twin Disciplines for all those 3 damage cards. Obviously, Deny works against everything, but those answers that just say outright kill it have less. So, for example, Culling Strike only gets beat by Twin Disciplines. Vengeance only gets beat by Deny. Ravenous Flock costs 1 mana, so a lot of times it's really hard to outdo the Ravenous Flocks, and we've seen it plenty of times before of like double Ravenous Flock or Ravenous Flock plus other answer. It's just because it costs 1 mana, it becomes really easy for you to beat that matchup of just like you don't have enough mana to respond when your opponent's paying 1 mana.
Whoa,
Yo, Dog of Wisdom.
Dog of Wisdom. Do we know
Twitch
this
Prime.
guy? Do we know this man?
Dog of Wisdom, that is our European affiliate, I believe.
Something.
How you doing, man? The homie coming through. Definitely check out his Twitch channel, everybody in chat.
Also, I just want to apologize to chat. I know we just started not too long ago, but we do try and focus on the content we're doing the podcast, focusing mostly on the discussion. But I'll take the time right now because we're probably going to move on to another deck after this to read some of your questions. Whale is pretty unnecessary. Yeah, I think that we agree that Whale is probably not well suited for the current format. An A-tier Thresh deck. I think that bomb deck, that GP Gangplank deck, and Thresh isn't that bad. Monkey Bomb Control, whatever you want to call it. Do you guys think Heimer will get nerfed? Absolutely.
Yes. If Heimer doesn't get nerfed, I'm concerned for Riot's balance team. I would imagine there's been some employee shift going on over there.
Do we think it's just going to be a mana change? Do we think he's just going to go to 6 or something? Or you think
that's the easiest way?
Right. That seems to be a lot of Riot's balance changes. Like, we can just make a card cost 1 more mana, and it's probably fairly worse, but not completely nerfed into the ground. For Heimerdinger, it makes a lot of sense of just setting up the timing to play the card. It's going to become harder to protect him with 1 less mana substantially, as we've seen it time and time again, of how that lines up with turn 5, you can protect him with 3 mana cards, and turn 6, you can protect him with 4 mana cards, and it just shifts that clock back a whole turn, gives your opponent more mana to respond to it as well. It just... There's the card is clearly just way too powerful right now. So I really can't imagine that they wouldn't nerf it, but I don't have I can't think of a guaranteed way that they would do it. It doesn't seem super obvious outside of 6 mana, probably the safest bet.
Are gonna be cards balanced for the next patch? Yes, the next balance patch will be 1.4. Right now we're on 1.3. Hopefully it will get nerfed, as we saw the balances are most costly. Yeah, it's just the most obvious way. Hopefully they've, because I think Heimerdinger is such a delicate card that um, he plays. He was clearly made with like the spell curve, with the banking of 3 mana and things in mind, and the cost of spells. So it's a very delicate situation. So hopefully they don't make him terrible.
There's a good chance that they might do that. They might
Yeah, just ruin him.
over nerf him and just like, turrets cost 3 mana to play now. This card's just dead. Heimerdinger's a 1/1 now. Have fun. Good luck. Good luck protecting him.
I don't know. They've been
Right.
defending Karma and Ezreal for a while. I guess they did get around to Karma. But anyway, our next deck, one of the most featured decks you'll probably see in various forms, but this is the most common list, is MF Sejuani. Just a very strong, similar to mid-range Demacia in prior to patch 1.2. Very well statted units. Omen Hawk makes your deck if your unit isn't that well statted. So like a 3/5 Island Navigator is fantastic. Even a 3/4 Hired Gun is great. And then it just uses that, that thing that everybody loves, yoink, pilfer, whatever, steals all the cards in your deck. Twofold, which means that Demacia is very much lacking draw, and then this gives you draw, but it's also disruptive for your opponent, which makes it even more valuable. And then everybody's favorite Riptide Rex is just a untenable situation where you either invest into your board and Riptide Rex blows it up, or you don't play anything and Riptide Rex hits your face.
Yes.
And then it's just a very strong deck overall, well-rounded. Yeah, there's just not a lot to target in terms of like a counterplay for this deck. Heimerdinger, perhaps, just because of the raw value of a Heimerdinger, and this deck also doesn't have a way to remove him straight up. But in terms of overall strategy, not really a lot to do to this.
Yeah, the deck's just nuts and plays all the good pilfer cards and abuses buffs and mid-range strategies. It's just really powerful. And Riptide Rex is a pain in the butt. I think that's another card that they need to take a look at for sure.
I think it's probably one of the main reasons why this deck is doing so well in the meta
Yeah.
right now is that games that can't be solved by your curve and it feels like your opponent is stabilizing and turning the corner in the late game are just solved by the pure absurdity of Riptide Rex's Cannon Barrages. It is an absolutely ridiculous card. And I think we're all pretty positive that this card will receive a nerf in the future, if not the next balance. It can't go unchanged for too much longer. The other thing, too, is that having access to Black Market Merchant, Pilfered Goods, and Yordle Grifter, as Matt said before, of one of the shortcomings of a lot of these aggressive decks is they run out of cards too fast. Not only do they refill their hand very well, they can often do it with discounted cards, and the deck is already, as an aggressive deck, one of the most mana-efficient decks that there is right now, and then they become even more mana-efficient by stealing discounted cards, and they can fill all of the holes currently by taking cards out of your deck. So things like what Matt said of, sometimes it can be hard to beat the Heimerdinger deck because you don't actually have an answer to Heimerdinger. Well, Riptide Rex is kind of like a catch-all for most decks of once you make it to that, you can solve a lot of problems. But if you steal cards out of your opponent's decks, the decks that this deck doesn't have direct answers for X endgame strategy of that deck is in those decks. For example, Heimerdinger. If you steal cards out of Heimerdinger's deck, almost all of them are good against Heimerdinger. If you steal an elusive card, that blocks their elusives. If you steal any of their removal cards, those kill Heimerdinger. There's very few bad pulls that you can be getting. I think the main one is Flash of Brilliance is probably the only card that you're like, damn, I really, really don't want to get this card. But pretty much everything else is very solid. Chempunk Pickpocket or whatever 2-drop your opponent decides to play is, it's pretty whatever. I mean, like, your deck can make use of it, but it's not very good in that matchup. And then just the access to the buffed cards. There's a lot of overstated units in this deck. And then the Riptide Rex, again, at the end is like, you can just crush all of the opposing aggro decks by outstatting them and then having an actual board wipe in your deck that fits in. It's just very powerful. And yeah.
Poison Dart Frog also mentioned through card attrition, and it's just like, yeah, you not only are you outstatting them too, I mean, you are outvaluing them with cards like Pilfered Goods and Black Market Merchant. I mean, this is a mid-range deck that's not only able to beat you through stats, but in the late game just able to come back on any board state because of Riptide Rex, and able to generate multiple cards, cheap cards worth of value actual good cards, mind you, not just generating random cards or anything. Like we're taking 2 good cards out of my opponent's deck at minimum, with a Pilfered Goods, and those are actual cards, really playable, ladder worthy cards. So I mean, the deck just provides so much value as well as tons of stats, right?
Yes,
So
absolutely.
since patch 1.2, we've seen Sejuani in a ton of different decks, and this one has definitely solidified itself as the top dog. But do you think, and we get this question often, do you think Sejuani is worthy of a nerf? I can see the argument somewhere in like the same vein as a Vi, as just this card is too versatile and does too much. But it would be hard to say what this card would change and if it's too good or if it's just a solid champion.
I think if they were going to nerf it, it would probably just be the health stat, I think is the only way. And it's like pushing needing a nerf, but I just think there's so many more problematic cards that, like, I don't think Sejuani is really the issue with a deck like this. Like, it's just,
Yeah.
but you're right. It is so well rounded. It really can fit into any strategy, right? It's a strong defensive card. It's a strong offensive card, just an overall value unit. It's an absolute force every time that it comes onto the board. But I don't really know what you could do besides just -1 health. I think that's
So
like the only thing. And then
is she essentially what? But do you guys feel like, so just thinking of a previous card that was nerfed that was very similar, right? Thinking back to beta days, Hecarim was a 6-drop who was just so generically good and did a lot of just generically good things. Do we think that this is as strong of a card as Hecarim was?
No.
Like,
no, yeah, not it for the time. Just because it doesn't just like make you outright win the game. Hecarim was like an unstoppable proactive play. It was ridiculous. But I think it's a very strong observation of the stat line of the 6 mana 5/6 that Hecarim was, and we saw how much of a problem that was. And I think that is part of what makes Sejuani a problem at the moment, is the fact that dealing 5 damage doesn't kill her. And there's a lot of ways that you can currently deal 5 damage in Legends of Runeterra. But those are even starting to like fade out a little bit. Some of the big contenders for the 5 mana 5 damage slots were just the Demacia decks, but also opposing Sejuani's. I think that's kind of interesting that like you even see it a lot too, of like Sejuani hits Sejuani, but then it doesn't actually kill Sejuani. It lives at 1 HP, and then you have to find some other way to deal that additional damage.
right.
But overall, I don't think it's too powerful. It's a very strong card, and that's what champions should be. I think 6 mana champions should be strong cards, and I would like to see more champions have a power level near Sejuani's.
That's
I
a
think it's
very
a good place to be at.
What Bento said is also a very good point. Just that how powerful her champion spell is. Fury of the North, as we've already said, is such an insanely powerful card. This card is an insanely good champion, and then it also just gives you access to extra copies of it, being probably the best burst speed combat trick in the game right now.
That honestly probably is the most annoying part about Sejuani when playing around her, is when you see a Sejuani on the board and you want to kill the Sejuani, if they have another one in hand, it does become near impossible because of her spell being Fury of the North. It's a really good point that I don't think a lot of people actually consider at all, like for the most part, is that one of the problems with her could be the champion spell, just making it so that she never dies.
So we've mentioned nerfs and buffs in a similar way before. So we want a GP spell to get changed because the more or the he has more kegs, right? Or parlay?
It's parlay,
yeah.
which
More
sucks,
copies of your 5-drop
right.
becomes a 1 mana deal 1.
Right, and
Right.
we would like to see them adjust the champion spell as a form of a buff or a nerf. Do you think we'll ever see that?
I hope that we do, but I think it's something that Riot doesn't consider. I think it's too much of a change to a card to completely change a card's champion spell. We've never seen that before, if I'm not mistaken. And I don't think it's something that they want to do unless they really messed up on a champion spell and made it too powerful. I don't think Fury of the North is anywhere near like a problematic champion spell, but I think it would be an interesting way to nerf her, is make her champion spell something worse. I don't know what that would be, though, is the problem. There's nothing that makes more sense than Fury of the North. But I think they make those decisions for the champion spell more based off of what lines up and makes sense with the card, rather than thinking about it as a balancing factor of what that spell could be.
Yeah, they want it to be more thematic versus actual just balance.
Yes. Right, and plus it's all
like,
planned well in advance, so it doesn't seem likely. I guess the last thing I want to talk about with this deck, because we've talked about this deck a few weeks in a row now, Misfortune. Any thoughts on Misfortune?
She definitely makes 1 health creatures just less playable, as we said, and I think it is kind of interesting that she just kind of came into real popularity after we started seeing a lot less of these decks, other than like Heimer. But yeah, she has a ton of stats for 3 mana 3/3, right? Those are Draven stats, but I feel like what this card does is so much better than what Draven does, especially when in conjunction with like the scout cards that are naturally in her element, and as well as just like the Riptide Rex and Sejuani. She's just another way to trigger, even if she's just on her own, she's another way to trigger plunder, even if you're able to just get blocked, and that alone is very powerful. I could see this card being changed. I don't know quite how they'd nerf it, maybe a health stat reduction or something along those lines.
Yeah, it's hard to say because I feel like if they made this card worse, it would just be unplayable because it's like just above probably what a 3 mana champion should do in terms of power level. But if they adjusted her down with if you just put -1 point anywhere on this card, it would just feel so shit. I feel like overall. I think maybe decreasing her attack would actually just be a better way to nerf the card than decreasing her health, but I'm not really sure. It's just I just hate the concept of this card of it triggers your plunders and it defeats any shitty chump blockers against it's clearly meant to be put in an aggressive strategy. And I think when they designed the card, they wanted it to more be like plunder triggering and have more to do with that. But the way that it lines up in aggressive strategies of just the best thing to chump block against aggro decks is throwing your 1 HP like 1/1s in place of just in front of things. And also just having your guys value trade too is really fucking hard against this deck. That's one of the most aggravating things is like trying to take value trades. And we've seen it time and time again even when we're playing like Heimerdinger and things like that of like, oh, I have a solitary monk on the board and I want to block the 2/2. Or I have a Shadow Assassin on the board and I want to block a 1/1. I mean, there's a million ways that this lines up against a lot of decks, and I hate that it counters the generic card game strategy to play around this style of deck, which is just aggro, of just taking value trades. And it's one of the shortcomings of Bilgewater cards in general, is that they generate value, but their stats are kind of weak. Cards like Black Market Merchant is, they're only a 2/2. Island Navigator's only a 2/4. Yordle Grifter's only a 3/3. That's the main shortcoming of Bilgewater, and it completely solves that shortcoming in an aggressive strategy as well as defeats the counterplay for an aggressive strategy in one card sitting on the board. And then not to mention she has 3/3 stat line. So and
what about what if she had to go out?
I was in the same
that I
thought.
think
So I was thinking maybe just the first time she sees an attack would be a lesser nerf. So you couldn't do scout plays with it.
You couldn't scout Misfortune.
Right.
I think if she had to go out, that would be a pretty good
that
nerf.
would be
like
huge.
When this card attacks, and this card would still be really strong. But yeah, it would obviously just probably not. It'd probably still be played. I think you'd still play copies of it.
I would be skeptical. I think that
maybe not. Yeah,
maybe not in this kind of a list, but I don't know. It still would be a good aggressive card, but maybe not in this kind of list. I don't know.
It's another one of those champions like Sejuani where it feels like this is hard to find a good nerf for it because it doesn't feel broken. It's just kind of annoyingly powerful, and it's right at the limit of what a champion should be doing. But if all champions in the game were closer to that power level, maybe that would just balance down a lot better. And I think that's another reason why this deck does so well, of just having two champions that are just very, very strong, actually work pretty well together, and everything in the deck kind of it synergizes very well overall.
Hey,
they solve the shortcomings, basically. Like there's so many things in this deck that solves the shortcomings of a generic aggro strategy.
Right.
Like there's a lot of them. So
any change to MF would kill the card. Yeah, I agree. A lot.
Yeah.
Especially some of the suggestions that we had to either stat or if she had to go out to battle. I think that would very much hurt her.
It seems like she probably just
okay. You could change up the amount of time she has to see attack. Okay.
Yeah,
I don't even feel that. I just don't even feel like her flip is usually the issue, though. I feel like she flips
she
so
rarely
rarely.
gets there.
It's just
if she
the
saw
fact
4
that she
attacks,
sits there.
you're already crushing your opponent, right?
Yeah, like she sat there a while if you saw that many attacks. Like the main thing is just her triggers, the fact that things with 1 health, you can't like take trade ups against the deck because every time that they're swinging and she's on the board, you things that you would normally use to trade up and stay at 1 health now are just not actual blockers anymore. You might as well not even trade up, and it just changes the way that you have to combat versus that deck so much, and it makes cards like the spiderlings and turrets and all kinds of things just completely useless.
Right. It's like giving your board +1 attack is kind of what it does in terms of a trading sense. Obviously, that's better because or the +1 attack would be better if everything could just go face and they all deal 1 extra damage. But for a trading sense, yeah, all your 2/2s now or your 2 attack guys trade into 3 attack guys, your 1 attack guys trade into 2 attack guys. But then also it's like if something blocks with 1, it dies before combat. And there's so many times when it's so aggravating to try to beat an aggro deck with that effect on the board.
Right.
It's kind of it's kind of just ridiculous how much it solves the deck's attack turns of like you don't think about it, you just swing with everything because they can't value trade on you.
Right.
It's like
and we could definitely expect this deck to see a ton of play going forward. But yeah, until patch 1.4 has nerfs, this deck is going to be here on S tier, and we're going to move on. We're going to move on to the only deck that we didn't have in our S tier last week, and that's Endure Shadow Isles. We preferred a version without Elise, as we felt Elise, while she is good, there's just other cards to be playing over her, perhaps. You could even say Callista, there could be other cards to be playing over, but I think the meat of this deck is definitely in the units. Just really strong Curse Keeper deck. We've been waiting, I guess not waiting because we don't want to see this, but it's been puzzling that we haven't seen a very aggressive Curse Keeper Ravenous Butcher, which was like week 1 of beta. That's what everybody was playing. And then it just slowly degraded into more of Mist Wraiths, and you strayed from those. And then now we're seeing Curse Keeper Ravenous Butcher come back. And now Curse Keeper is even more efficient and consistent with more good activators, like a Blighted Caretaker. And we even see Ancient Crocolith make a little bit of I don't even want to say resurgence because this card was never good, but some play. Because just the sheer amount of units you have, especially expendable units, from the Haunted Relic or a Vile Feast or Aristocrat. The Caretaker makes 2 guys you can get rid of easily, and they all have a lot of good synergy with the new Callista. Callista did get changed from the last time that this deck was played. And then Neverglade Collector, another great synergistic card, and at the top you would play the They Who Endure, very obvious. Just you're doing all these great synergy plays of killing your own guys and getting a lot of board tempo and a lot of Nexus damage, and then you just drop a They Who Endure to clinch the game. And as far as the spell goes, just very clear-cut, usual cards. Glimpse Beyond, really want to use that card when your opponent's trying to address your board. You use this in response, you get some value back, you play more guys. Vile Feast, just a solid card. Fury of the North, this is like, I guess back then you would be playing Mark the Isle when it was actually good for 1 mana, but Fury of the North for 4 mana is still a great card. And then Atrocity just at the top end of the spells to get you victories that you're probably not supposed to be having.
Right.
Yeah, this deck is I think the number one reason why this came back into favor is I think Lux Karma would just crush this deck, and it's another one of those decks where we talked about with the Ledros Control deck, Lux Karma fell out of favor, making this deck a lot stronger. And the other one was this deck has a really good strat to just dunk on MF Sejuani. Like if they start the proper start with Cursed Keepers, Blighted Caretakers are really strong, and just big units in general, if you keep putting them in the way of MF Sejuani, is the best way to beat that deck. Of making that Misfortune 1 damage just not even matter because your units are so thick, and then still taking value trades. And it's kind of hard for them to keep up with the pace that this deck can, there's just the tempo this deck can put out sometimes with its good hands. I think
Also,
that Sejuani is kind of their only way to win. Like
the top end of this deck is really suited against a deck like that. Neverglade Collector, you cannot kill particular units. You can, even though the MF is killing your units, you're still doing damage to your opponent. And then a They Who Endure, and healing. Oh, yeah. So you're negating it. And then the They Who Endure, it's just what is this card is going to be a brick shithouse when it gets on the board. So that cannot do anything to that. Even a Riptide Rex, the They Who Endure will just eat that.
All of it.
Right.
It's definitely the best way to combat that deck is because they don't have spells really to deal with large units, and their units kind of struggle against large units. Generally speaking, the spells versus the MF Sejuani deck aren't as effective because a lot of them generate extra value on top of it. Even, we have Island Navigator, you have the Black Market Merchant, the Omen Hawk. MF is even, generating value on the attacks. Sejuani does something. They have just like really good units that don't actually, you can't trade well against them with spells. You just need units that are bigger to take value trades. And as we said before, it's hard to do that because of misfortune. So they kind of cover a lot of the holes that aggro decks usually have, and it's just so well rounded. But the best way to do it is just slam massive units that they just cannot deal with. And this deck excels at that. They have massive units as early as turn 2, just 4/4s. They're too big for the deck to handle. Blighted Caretaker's just a great way to clean up on board. Croc, especially, is just a great way, or as we call him, Dwayne the Croc Johnson, gets down on turn 4, a 7/7. They don't have Sejuani for 2 more turns. This card is
4
just
mana
cleaning house.
7/7s.
And then
Hey,
you have
we've
so
seen that in the
much
game
fodder
before.
for this card. Oh, yeah.
Big classic memes.
So why do you think this version is superior to, because we see a lot of variations of this deck, some people, not recently, but we've seen Mist Wraiths or Spiders more commonly. Why do you think this is the best version of it?
I think that having the early game package just is such a huge part of why this deck is crushing, and I think that just being able to go like Bark Beast into Curse Keeper Butcher on 2 is just something that basically no deck can deal with. Like Nick was saying, it's really good against the MF Sejuani decks. You're able to
it's
build
actual Exodia in this game. It's kind of crazy.
But even like Heimer, right? Like Heimer can't deal with that much aggression that early. Like it's so difficult. Like there's certain hands that you can put together that do, but if you're able to get those kind of crazy board states early on, you're able to just really run away with the game as well. Go wide is just a strategy that works really well versus those other decks. And you're just able to create such big, powerful plays throughout the game. I like the Callisto a lot. I think that it's a card that I think we've overall been down on for a while, and I think for good reason, but it has finally found a pretty decent home, I feel like, in this list. It is something that we potentially could cut, but I just think that overall I've been really impressed with the card in this list in particular, just because of the overall way that it works. I really like it with the Croc as well, being able to bring back 7/7s.
Oh yeah. Also, the deck, if you look at the just the curve of this deck, and I think Matt always brings this point up a lot of like if you're trying to find a way to make a deck better, and basic deck building philosophy is identify the holes in your deck and fill them with cards that solve those problems. And if you look at our curve, we have no turn 3 proactive play that is not dependent on something our opponent does. So Blighted Caretaker is all you have, which doesn't work 100% of the time on turn 3, even when you have the attack token. And then when you don't have the attack token on 3, because you're just on evens for the game, you don't want to play Blighted Caretaker on the defense. It's just too powerful of a push. So you're going to be forced to make suboptimal use of your mana on turn 3. And Callisto is just the best proactive play that you can be making for 3 mana in this deck. Not to mention, you have open champion slots. So you're not really, like, none of the champions are overwhelmingly good. And you have Callisto. Sejuani is definitely a popular pick, but we go back and forth on talking about that card. And although it is a very strong, well-rounded turn 6 play, that's one of the ways that this deck can lose is if it gets too clunky, like high-costed hands. And you already play Double Atrocity, Triple Deku Endure, the Crocs and the Neverglade Collectors, which are all, fine cards to be playing, but it can definitely, the more things you add to that pile, the less consistent your deck gets. The Haunted Relic is another card that we go back and forth on. Is this card necessary in the deck? But it does prove to do a lot, especially with the Croc and the Callista and Neverglade Collector. Can push for extra damage in the early game, can buff your Deku Endure by 3. Like it does there's a lot of synergies in the deck, like your Caretakers, even Butchers and Bark Beasts. There's all kinds of small things this card can do. Definitely would not recommend running it at 3. Very happy with the 2 in the deck. If potentially you wanted to run Sejuani and felt that was a better meta call at the time, that's probably the card that you would look to cut. I would say it's probably the weakest card in the list, but I'm a fan of the 2 copies for now.
Maybe you'd be cutting the Croc if you were just wanting to put Sejuani in.
Possibly, but I really like the Croc. I was like skeptical at first, but I'm like, nah, it makes sense. Of like, I think that's one of the best things about this deck right now, and why it's doing so well is just because of how well it does against the MF Sejuani deck. And that card on turn 4 against that deck is just game over. Like they can come back sometimes from the 4-4 start, but that's usually the catalyst for a good game against MF Sejuani. And then if you followed up with the Croc, or even just if you didn't find that in the early game and have the Croc on 4, it's like, what do they do? Their Sejuani doesn't come down for 2 more turns, and Riptide Rex doesn't come down for 4 more turns. That's
Right.
their big ways to shift the tempo back in their favor. Until then, the Croc is just crushing it all day long. They just cannot deal with a 7/7. Fury of the North on something like a Yordle Grifter, like on the following turn, or if they had like their MF on board already, or a Jagged Butcher or something like that. And then they're trading, and usually it does feel like a 2-for-1, even though you did sack 2 cards, because usually your sacrifices were things that didn't matter.
Right.
What do you think could move this deck out of the S tier? Do you think there's a hard counter to this deck? We obviously are aware that there really isn't a counterplay that can beat an opening like Bark Beast, Curse Keeper, Ravenous Butcher. But if there was a deck that would be designed to beat an Ender Shadow Isles deck, what would it be?
Well, Lux Karma used to just be like the perfect deck, and I would think something that plays a lot of what that deck plays, like cards like what is it? I mean, like most of the Demacia lineup just did pretty well at answering like stronger starts, and then having Will of Ionia deny healing cards, more like kind of those just mid-rangey cards in general that are well statted and similar statted, and just having answers to their big power plays. Will of Ionia, I think, is the big one, of just like if you can find Will of Ionia anywhere, like it just helps a lot. I think sea monsters actually do fairly well against this, if they
Deep is
start
not
properly.
bad versus this deck because they played all the Vengeances at the top, which everybody should be playing 2 to 3 Vengeance in every deep deck, probably 3 at this point. But yeah, like you're able to develop big board states that are larger than what this deck is able to do, as well as you're playing a lot of lifesteal in your deck, and you have like Maokai for inevitability and stuff. So as long as you're able to start developing that board state and then start vengeancing the They Who Endures when they hit, you can definitely get there with the deep deck. It is difficult though. I'd say if they hit that Exodian nut, it is just difficult for any
Right,
deck
yeah.
to deal with that.
They do have some good tools, though. I think that Jaw Hunters is a really important one to kill the 4/4s in the early game. Dead Bloom Wanderer is another big one. And then once they start getting their big units online, it definitely it can help as long as they curve out. The problem with Deep, though, is that them curving out is a very exact combination of cards a lot of the time. Whereas in this deck, there's a lot of combinations of cards that create powerful curves in the early game. So I would say the odds are in favor of the Endure deck kind of out high rolling them, but the deep deck doesn't have to just completely high roll to beat the opening curve. Just think if they draw something reasonable though and start hitting that turn 5, turn 6 and get their deep online at a reasonable pace, they can start outpacing the deck. Vengeance, very important part of that though, as Anton said. I think that every deep deck right now should be playing 2 to 3 copies of Vengeance for sure to combat this, as well as just having a good answer for Sejuani and Heimerdinger. It just does so much. The mirror as well. Like the card is just so strong in this current format.
Yeah, I think we're gonna see Endure Shadow Isles for a while. We just, a little lapse in the meta for sure, and now we see it back in a very prominent spot. Let's talk about sea monsters, though. We could definitely start with sea monsters. This is our deck from 1.3. We just updated it. Hired Gun. We've been loving this new card. So much better than Horny Chode. That card sucks. Never play it again.
Dead, Horny Chode is
same
booty.
Great curve.
Never forget.
Beast Blow. It's just a nice unit on 4. I could see this card definitely being in that flex spot consideration, but I think units is where this deck can sometimes falter if it just has way too many spells in hand. It's not able to really do anything on board, and that's where it falls behind. Then the rest of it's pretty self-explanatory. The Shipwreck Order and the Terror of the Tides at the top end because of how great they are and powerful, especially when they're cheap with Nautilus. And then the spells, 2 Miscall, you play a lot of strong guys, you want to bring back a strong guy. 2 Atrocity, just that great reach. And then triple Vengeance, we already sang praises about Vengeance. But yeah, if you can see, obviously, it's cut of the Drain package. It's really just not necessary at the moment, given the current meta. What do you guys have to say about Sea Monsters this week? We've seen it less prominent than the prior week. People are even vying for it to be in that S tier conversation, but we've definitely seen it slip to even the bottom of A tier?
I feel like it's honestly towards the top of A tier still. The main reason why this deck isn't S tier, and we've said it before, is just you just get dunked on by Heimerdinger. It's ridiculous. I think the analogy
Right.
I used last week is the NBA player going up against the YMCA rec team, just dunked on, destroyed. There's absolutely no competition. It is near impossible for this deck to beat that deck, which is just kind of a horrible thing for going into ladder if there's a matchup that is just very prevalent, arguably the best deck in the game, destroys you like with no contest. But against the other S tier decks, I think Deep has a lot of really strong tools. And if as the meta seems to be shaping up even more to people only playing Endure and only playing MF Sejuani, I think this deck has a very reasonable strategy against both of those decks, which I still think it puts it at the top of A tier, only to be pushed out by the fact that it's like a 20-80 matchup against Heimerdinger at best. Like I mean, maybe a little bit better with the Triple Vengeance, but it's as well as the Hired Gun. Both of those cards have definitely helped a lot. But oh man, that matchup is so rough. It feels hard to say it's yeah, I probably do still feel pretty confident it's towards the top of A tier. I think it was before, and it probably still is. Of just it just has great tools against all the other decks. It's just one matchup. Oh,
Do you anticipate a variation, perhaps, to maybe even just completely forego the Heimer? You have no chance, you just give up on it. And do you think there could be another variation of this deck that we haven't seen to maybe beat the rest of the meta?
I feel like the list we provided here is pretty solid. Like, don't really respect timer. Like, I mean, we did cut the whales, we've cut the grasps, things like that, and just we do still keep vengeance, of course, because of how well it lines up versus the rest of the format. But naturally, having 3 vengeance is also very good against Heimer, especially in a format where a lot of these smarter Heimer players are realizing that Deny is just not doing a lot versus what's on ladder and master right now. So I do think that also potentially playing a one of Thresh is just better this format as we've started to see things come along. I could definitely see that coming into play. It's the same kind of concept as why we're playing Vi in the Karina list. Just being able to cash back up on the board versus certain things and just have a big threatening challenger unit is just really good in this format as well. And Thresh naturally challenges Heimer, Callista, Misfortune, all kinds of those good things that we normally would have a lot of issues with, like Misfortune making our dredgers and our jaw hunters just absolutely atrocious blockers. So maybe Thresh is an answer here.
I do quite like Thresh in this deck. I don't know how the champion numbers would play out, but I think at least one is where I want to see him. The Beasts Below, do you want to explain the reasoning behind this card? And if you don't feel it's very suited for the current format, what do you think it could be instead?
I don't feel like it's terrible in the current format, but I feel like it could be more copies of Missed Call. It could be more copies of uh we could potentially look at putting Grasp in the deck. I'm not
Is
it
there
does
another
feel like
unit?
it's a not really. No, I wouldn't say another unit. I would say I'm probably looking at all the units I'd be wanting to play are already in the deck. Beast Below would be the only one that I'm considering cutting for maybe more answers to matchup specific things. But that 4/4 does line up really well versus certain things, and it allows you to trade up on some units with hired gun that you just normally would have no way to deal with that efficiently. So sometimes it's just a really and not with hired gun. That's obviously over the course of a few different turns, right? But being able to like hired gun a Maokai and then challenge it, or a Grizzled Ranger, something like that, feels really good when you're playing Beast Below, and that's kind of the only card that you would be able to do that with, as well as it just being a really insane play when you are able to play Nautilus on 7 if you were to kind of turbo deep, and then you're able to play free 7/7s. Nautilus plus a 7/7 is lethal, any 7/7 of any form, so pretty relevant.
Um,
I'm a big fan of another Missed Call potentially over the Beast Below. I think it helps with just you have cards that are very key players against specific decks, and just having the redundancy factor of continuing to play those cards, and I think there's just a lot of strong cards like Dead Bloom Wander in certain matchups is just crushing to keep playing, and it's a 3-drop. Same thing with Jaw Hunters, Maokai in specific matchups, that go very long of just they keep trying to kill it, like we've seen when we were playing the Ledros Control deck of kill Maokai, they miss call, and we're just like we were talking about the strategy against this deck is like we're probably gonna have to kill a Maokai 4 to 5 times against this deck. Like just every chance we have to kill this card, we are taking it. They will resummon it, and we will kill it again. That is kind of where it's at. Maybe I don't know if a third copy of Salvage ever finds its way back in. We've gone back and forth on how much you need that card in the deck, and 2's felt pretty fine. Right. Maybe Terror of the Tides and Shipwreck Hoarder, like we play around the numbers there of just looking at where the
maybe
the metagame's going, but
those 2 might not even be necessary anymore given the current state of things. That would be consideration too. Maybe Shipwreck Hoarder more so than Terror of the Tides. Terror of the Tides can still allow you to really just
win the game. Seems pretty good,
yeah,
right?
Fearsome is so good right now. Like Fearsome in this current format is very, very often just almost elusive. Like if you watched us play Heimer, or if you've just kind of if you've gotten your face beat in by a turn 3 Callista, you just quickly realize, or a turn 2 Elise, like, oh, I just don't really play a lot of things right now that block Fearsome. Of course, unless you're playing an Omen Hawk deck and you're high rolling, then you don't give a fuck. But
okay, well, I think we've definitely talked enough about this deck. Still a solid A tier deck, I would say. It's a mainstay of the metagame, just on the lower end of the spectrum of, I guess we could say it's in the A, not S. It's not even in the, it's not sniffing S anytime soon, but still a solid deck.
Heimer matchup. Heimer matchup's still a little too rough.
Heimer matchup is bad.
Do you expect a nerf to deep? Absolutely not. Vile Feast. No. Vile Feast just doesn't feel great right now.
Yeah, we were talking about it before in the Ledros Control deck and evaluating Vile Feast in the current metagame, and it's often just too low value. It doesn't kill enough. It's just very corner case scenarios of like it's really strong when it works, but I would say probably like 70% of the time that you draw the card, it doesn't actually do anything that meaningful. It's just rough.
Someone had mentioned Fiora decks. What are your thoughts on Fiora decks as a potential to counter, like Fiora Unyielding Spirits to counter the They Who Endure list early on in the early game and just kind of kill things and protect
I think
her?
Demacia in general has a lot of really good tools to beat it.
Right.
Unyielding Spirits, one of the big ones, and the Lifesteal
was one of the strongest answers to that
Radiant,
deck.
like their whole curve is just good at managing that, and then their top end is good answers for their top end.
Right.
Problem is all the other matchups,
Judgment,
it's like it's not worth playing just to beat the Endure deck when you don't do that well against the other decks.
So this deck was our deck, especially at the end of the week, last week when we were going into the podcast, our expected deck to really shine in the current week and be one of the most popular decks, and we were right. Is the Noxus Elusive decks, but we've even seen, we'll talk about the other variant too in a minute, the Noxus Elusive deck and the Frey Elusive deck. We see this very common shell in even Frey when we see Swain or Vladimir with Frey, and the Precious Pack, Crimson Disciple, Demolitionist, Grenadier, Transfusion, Fervor, Decimate, just pure great damage cards. And then you take that skeleton from Elusive, and it just creates a really strong power threshold.
Yeah, honestly, I think this is just the best burn deck to be playing right now. This is just the new burn. I don't think that the old Noxus built over list really has any upside to it over this one of just the there's just a lot more burn damage in that deck, but the unit potential is just so much worse than in this. There's a lot of decks right now that Elusives just don't get blocked. Like against the Endure deck, you can just kill them before they start to really solidify their game-ending plays. Same thing with MF Sejuani. It's like you just don't block. Like, and their MF is not killing your cards. Their cards are not, like, you will just outrace them, simply put. And they have no way to counter your burn in that deck. They have no way to counter your burn in the Endure deck. Against the Deep deck, they have like a few more tools to deal with your guys, but depending on how they choose to tech out their deck, a lot of times just an early game aggressive strategy of Elusives don't really have an answer to. Heimerdinger, it's a little up in the air about how that one really goes down, because although they do have good answers for your units and a lot of elusive blockers, the sheer amount of burn can definitely pull you ahead there. But that's where probably the only deck where it feels like the Noxus Piltover deck is going to have a better time of just, you want more of those direct damage cards than unit-based damaging cards. Deck definitely fares a lot better against the Elusives. Overall, though, this deck is just, seems like the best way to play Elusives and the best way to play Burn. It's just such a high synergy.
Quite funny how when we were talking about cards that needed to be nerfed in the Burn deck prior to 1.2, the cards that they nerfed ended up being Rookie, which was a card in Piltover and Zon, and then they nerfed a card that didn't actually deal damage. We talked about how every card in this deck was dealing damage, and then they ended up nerfing a Rear Guard, which was not a card that actually said on it deal damage, though it was a very oppressive and very high rolling 1-drop. When you did have it with the attack token, it actually wasn't one of the cards that dealt damage. So Noxus is just dealing a lot of damage on its own. It doesn't really need the Boom Crew Rookie and the burn spells to get there. It just does so much damage on its own. Decimate is a really, really powerful, scary spell once it starts dropping, especially in conjunction with the Disciple, Demolitionist, Grenadier, Transfusion,
That combo
Fervor
is silly.
package. Like, all of that is just so much damage.
I can't believe that like Disciple Demolitionist is like a thing. I feel like Demolitionist is a very ridiculous card that like they just didn't need to add. Mostly it's like,
sure.
we talked about before, of like why the burn decks are so powerful, and it's not that the individual burn cards are too strong, it's just the fact that there are this many that are playable.
Mm-hmm.
Like we have Disciple,
very
Demolitionist, Grenadier, Noxian Fervor, and Decimate all in a deck that like there's so much burn, and then you have all the elusives on top of that, and buff cards, and
which might as well just
like,
be burn spells.
Monk too can literally just put Demolitionists back into your hands, can put your elusive guys back into your hand, protect them, reuse them. You have cards like Transfusion triggering Disciple, and then Disciple also gets triggered off of combats. And yeah, that card is very, very annoying to deal with playing as a deck. Maybe Disciple is too strong in the burn package, more so than the other cards. I mean, potentially if they wanted to deal with direct damage, but it's mostly just the redundancy of how many of these damaging cards that we have. It's still just, I think will always prove strong. There will always be an A tier or better burn deck in every format of Legends of Runeterra until the end of time, pretty much, unless they significantly reduce just the sheer number of burn cards. And I really hope they don't print any more. I think they've identified it, and like you said, it was kind of odd to see that, like, I guess it was obvious that they were going to nerf Rear Guard and Boom Crew Rookie because the stat lines of those two cards just didn't mathematically line up with every other card in the game. They clearly, just from a macro point of view of how Legends of Runeterra is, those cards both needed -1 health. But like you said, it's like, it was weird to see they didn't nerf any of the actual direct damage cards. And yes, Boom Crew is, but that wasn't really the point of that nerf, of just like, it was the direct damage, but like it's a unit that could, just attack.
It's something you can interact with.
Right. But the direct damage of, like Fervor, Decimate, all like cards like this in Demolitionist, Grenadier, of uninteractable damage for the most part. Outside of like, yes, you could kill the target for Demolitionist and Fervor, but the way that this deck plays, you aren't just like, it doesn't work like that. It's you play the card to remove their card first, and then they respond with a card like Fervor. They often aren't just making proactive Fervor plays when you have all your mana open.
Anton brought up a great point. Noxus simply doesn't need Piltover. It has enough burn on its own. It has agency within itself now, especially with Imperial Demolitionist and Fervor in the same expansion. It just doesn't need Piltover anymore, and that's when this very strong unit-based skeleton of Elusives comes back into the mix, and this deck is just incredible.
I think Noxus is just still a little too overtuned in their burn package, and nerfing cards that you can answer on the board versus cards that just deal direct damage to face, which is what they said was on their watch list anyway, specifically things that go face and how they work. Like, they didn't actually touch any of those those cards, and you just have big pockets of burn. And there's almost, it's another thing we've talked about on the podcast before, there's just almost no heal in this game. So that burn package is just too good if there's literally just no heal in the game.
Right. This deck is all just about faces the plays, whether you're playing a unit or a spell. It's just face, face, face.
Yep.
What do you think could change to any of these cards? Do you anticipate any changes to cards in this deck?
Solitary Monk is the main one that we've been talking
Monk,
about for a
Right.
long
We definitely
time.
think that Solitaire Monk could be at least a 3/3 and still be very playable.
Yeah, I think this card is just way too strong, and honestly, ironically is one of the best cards in the deck, because you would think a deck that puts this many units on the board in an aggressive strategy this would be the last deck that you would think would play Solitary Monk. But there's a disgusting amount of value and utility that Solitary Monk provides for this deck, in the form of you're just using your units to burn your opponent. And this is the best way to connect units to the opponent's face, is Elusive, and that's why it has such a strong synergy with these burn cards to finish off the game. But it returns cards off the board, like Green Glade Duo and Shadow Assassin, Ivory Conspirator, and the elusive guys, to protect them, your cards that are permanently elusive, and then B, you have cards like Navori Blade Scout that you can reutilize their elusive, and a 2/1 elusive for 1 is very strong. The downside being it doesn't retain that, because obviously that would be absurd. But you can then keep replaying the card, and cards like Demolitionist, being able to replay them, resetting the health on your Disciple, anything, and just healing your cards too is so strong when you feel like you're turning the corner against a deck like this and starting to answer, some of the cards on their border. Like, you have a card like Static Shock in your hand, and your opponent has like Double Blade Scout or Green Glade Duo and a Grenadier or something like that, and then they just go, before they pass out, it's just like, oh, just pick up all my cards on your turn. I'm not attacking this turn. So then you put these cards back in your hand to protect, and it's like, okay, now deal with the 4/3, and then next turn I'm going to play these cards. You can really just screw your opponent on turns like that, and just
It's insane
reutilize
how many
value.
times you can play this Crimson Disciple Imperial Demolitionist combo in one game.
Yes. Especially because she keeps healing herself. You can just transfusion to keep healing
Yeah,
it.
oh,
Or
yeah.
Twin
Or you pick it
Disciplines
back
to keep
up.
healing it. Pick it back up. Retreat it. All kinds of things. I mean, yeah, just over and over.
So what do you think is keeping this deck out of S tier?
Probably just that things that can interact with it just are probably a little too good right now. Maybe Heimer just can't die to this deck. Have you guys had issues with Heimer playing against this list?
Not
really.
much,
I
no.
mean, they can kind of like nut draw, but for the most part, it's like they just don't have enough burn. So I think Heimer's one of the big ones.
Right, because like
Even
their
the
way of
deep
getting
deck
through.
has good ways to deal with this deck a lot of the time.
Right,
Early
they
game,
have
just
the
like
heal.
the heal and the challengers are a big part of it, and any of their mid game spells can start pushing them out of the game. But I feel like this deck still does pretty well against the deep. They need a pretty specific hand to stop it. MF Sejuani sometimes can outpace you, but a lot of the times, again, it's not likely. Like I think a lot of times you outpace them in damage dealing and try to kill them before they get to the late game.
Right, but Hired Gun does feel like it might be a rough card for this list to deal with. You have a lot of 2/2s.
Yeah. Any vulnerable cards, any challenger cards, I think is where this deck definitely struggles, because they need their units to live a lot longer than the Piltover version of the deck does, I would say, overall. Just because they have more cards that just deal direct damage, so they need fewer unit hits overall. Whereas this deck needs like something like 10 damage in unit hits, and then they might be able to burn for 10, or maybe close to like the 11-12 range on unit damage, and then they're going to try to burn for around 8, I think is probably a safer bet. Something like, Grenadier Demolitionist, some 2-pointers, and then maybe like a Fervor or a Decimate to top it off. But that's like the main shortcoming, is just the unit-based rule. I think Blighted Caretaker is one of the main problems in win rate over a large sample size of games against the They Who Endure deck. If you're putting against the attack token on 3 and plays Blighted Caretaker, and you can't just monk and pick up your cards, they might be able to clear too much of your board for you to really outpace that deck. Because how you end up beating the Endure deck is the fact that you're just playing all these elusive cards your opponent can't interact with, and you just outrace them before they get to a play like They Who Endure and Atrocity. And then also the inclusion of Neverglade Collector, sometimes they stabilize with the healing. But Blighted Caretaker seems like the big one of like, there's one card that can kind of crush your game plan of like, they grab any of your 1-drops and then a Green Glade Duo on 2 is just that's huge. Even when you're playing something like Conspirator to put something back into your hand, they grab the Conspirator then, and it's a lot of lost tempo in those challenger and vulnerable cards.
Right.
All right, and I'm gonna before we make like a referendum on the whole archetype, I also want to move to the other variant, the classic Elusives. We see this deck since the dawn of time, it feels like, with Zed, Omen Hawk, Green Glade Duo, just very strong units. Kinko Wayfinder is definitely the edge that this deck has over the Noxus variant. Just an incredibly strong, maybe even broken effect. And then at the top end, the Windfarer Hatchling is also pretty nice to be having in your deck. Deny in certain matchups, as well as Will of Ionia, is exactly what you need to just stop a deck from being able to take your board back or being able to heal. And then Fury of the North is just one of the best combat tricks in the game.
Especially for a deck like this. Yeah.
Right.
Omen Hawk and Fury of the North, great card.
Do you think that one is better than the other necessarily?
They're really close. I think they just have different strengths against different matchups, but probably end up with a pretty similar win rate. I feel like I would be more inclined to play the burn variation of the deck. I think it's probably better at closing out games, but I think the Freljord version might have just it seems like it has the way higher high roll potential in this deck. I think the burn deck is a lot more straightforward and consistent of hitting your opponent for 20. It's good at just getting the job done, but I think this deck can create more board states that are just absurd, or just make ridiculous high roll pushes through the mid and early late game of just getting turns with Zed that happen to resolve on 3. Since the beginning of Runeterra, that's kind of just one of the strongest plays, but it kind of just depends on the matchup that you're playing against, because I feel like it's a little more punishable, a little more easier to counter, whereas the burn one is just a lot more consistent and harder to counter because it just uses the burn cards. But I think that having elusive blockers, for something like Heimerdinger, I think is one of the perfect examples of this deck should never beat Heimerdinger if the Heimerdinger drew an even remotely playable hand, just because they play elusive guys, they block your guys, they eventually get a Heimerdinger, you never get an attack through again, you can't lose. Whereas the burn deck has all those burn cards. It's just you have so much reach. There's so many more ways to finish the game once you've hit your early game curve, your normal consistent curve.
I'm a big fan of the Frey version as maybe even better because I love this top end. I think Windfarer Hatchling is just an incredible. I have a board of sucky cards. I need a lot of reach right now. Windfarer Hatchling buff my whole board. That's lethal. I also like the access to Will of Ionia and Deny.
Those are the big ones, I think, probably.
And also just the nut of open Omen Hawk into buffing a curve is just something that is hard to evaluate how important that is.
Yeah, I am a fan of this list because of Kinko Lifeblade as well. I just feel like Kinko Lifeblade with Jeweled Protector and Omen Hawk and Fury of the North in specific is just he's a way that you can just combat all of the burn strats. And,
right, any burn deck against a Kinko Lifeblade feels really
wrecked.
bad.
Yeah.
What's in this deck is probably the main strength is just how flexible it is overall. Versus the other deck of I feel like the other one's more efficient at dealing 20. Is my initial kind of just summarization of the deck. Is just it deals 20 very well, and that's why it's a very strong deck. But this deck can pivot its game plan at certain points of the game, has more counterplay. It's a little more flexible against decks, whereas the burn deck is kind of just you're crushing your opponent, or it didn't work out, and then your opponent from the turn 5 moving forward will just start beating you if they're not in burn range. That's kind of just how it is.
Right.
Whereas this deck definitely has more comeback potential in those stages of the game.
I think the other deck is favored versus Heimer, though. I feel like Nick said this deck, but you queue up against this with Heimer and you're feeling pretty good. Most times you're just as long as I draw a Heimer, I'm in it, man. There's no way I lose.
Right, yeah, I do agree. I think this is what keeps this deck out of a potential S tier is because of just how much Heimerdinger we see, and most times when we see even an Ez Karma deck that curves the same way against this deck.
Right. Yeah, I feel like the other deck has a better Heimer matchup and just like a better matchup versus more of what we're seeing on ladder as well, just
Right.
currently.
I agree. It probably makes it more suited for the current metagame.
I think
Um,
yours might be better, like or Frey might just be the better tournament one, maybe. I don't know.
Elusives are JP Stonegar says Elusives are going to evade the nerf hammer for another patch again because right, probably.
Probably, yeah. Just
What
because
about
there are
using
things
Elixir of
overshadowing
Iron?
them.
What about
Kinko
using Elixir
Wayfinder,
of
that is the
Iron with
answer
1 mana rather than a 4 mana Fury of the North? I do agree that you usually don't have 4 mana available, and that a card like Elixir of Iron is more in tune with what the deck is doing. But I do like the high end value of a Fury of the North. I
I
think
think it
that
just makes it easier to win the game of like the
right,
card doubles as protection, as well as pushing additional damage. So your opponent goes to play a spell, kill your card, you end up using Fury of the North that not only addresses that card as a response, but then pushes for additional damage, which is just massive. And especially in combination with something like the Kinku Lifeblade, it can just be a game changer for sure. If there was enough space to play both, that would be great. But that's a mistake that I think a lot of people make, is trying to fit too many Frey cards. Because if your Kinku Wayfinder ends up whiffing and you miss on the allegiance, you'll probably lose the game on the spot. I would say 80% of the time, something like that. If your Kinku Wayfinder whiffs, it's really, really crushing. And that's the strongest thing in your deck. This is by far the most powerful card. So having that not work out is not really something that you ever really want to have happen.
It's also just that the Fury of the North, like just thinking about it more as I've been thinking about it. Just the 4 health buff, that's like the highest health buff that any spell gives, right? Like we have an 8 mana spell that gives you +8/+4, and then this is the only other thing that gives you 4 health. And that's a lot of like shield, and because of the way that health and healing works in this game, it absorbs the entire damage impact, and you still just get to go back to full health once the turn's over. Like that spell is just
So versatile.
insane.
Like
Yeah.
it just does so much to protect your board and push. Like you need cards like Battle. We see people playing cards like Battle Fury just to push that extra damage, and that card just pushes 4 and makes a card invincible in that deck. It's so
Yes.
strong.
It's pretty nuts.
and then finally,
Maybe that card needs tweaking.
Zeus Juicy says
I need to run
you
it back to
guys
real quick.
might have already touched on it. Do you think Yoink will be addressed? We'll talk about it more after as we get into more general things of nerfs and buffs. But yes, it will be addressed.
We do think it would
without
be.
a doubt. There's no way that they don't.
In
And,
some way, shape, or form.
It's impossible if they want to continue as a game. People clearly dislike it, so they're gonna have to change it. We talked about this because we feel like this deck is the predecessor to that, or at least part of the predecessor to the Ionia Noxus deck is the original, the OG, the Aggro burn deck. Patch 1.2 clearly had a lot to do with this deck, hitting both the rear guard and the Broom Crew rookie. But this deck is still really good. It has great damage potential still. Just an insane curve. 9 1-drops. No deck has 9 1-drops, so you're always hitting a 1-drop. That's a huge advantage in an aggro deck. Huge damage, pure burn potential with every single spell except Transfusion situationally doing damage. Just the same old gang, the Crimson Disciple, the Demolitionist, the Grenadier. The Cask Salesman gives you a little bit of turn. It can give you a little bit of an extra turn sometimes, getting those blockers, and even does 2 damage to boot. And then the rest of the deck, it speaks for itself. This deck is an incredibly great aggro deck. I don't know what else to say about it. It's here to stay.
Yeah, definitely a contender. Still a really great deck. Feels good every time I play it. It still is every time we see it versus as a Heimer player, we're pretty sad, right?
Oh, for sure. This deck still kicks Heimer's ass given it doesn't brick, or the player does not completely just, screw the punt.
Like we were saying, the elusive burn list is definitely better versus the majority of things, but this list in particular just crushes Heimer because as Heimer we have elusive things, so we're able to actually present blocks and do things versus elusive decks. But versus this deck, you replace all those elusive things with just direct burn spells even more, and we're just like, there's nothing that we can really do about it.
So we talked about it last week, and we're just going to reiterate. The Teemo version, we've seen Teemo replace Legion Rearguard in a lot of decks. How do you feel about that?
Personally, I'm on the Teemo train for that deck. I think Teemo is a solid one drop in replacement of Rearguard in the current format. I just feel like he probably gets in at least more than once, because he is elusive, and there's just not a lot of elusives being played in, the MF Sejuani deck or any of those things. Granted, if they do find a way to make him vulnerable, with the 2-drop, what's the card? Hired Gun, yeah. Then Teemo gets sniped really easily, and there is lots of answers to him, of course, but I think that overall what he does is better than generally what Rearguard is doing versus most of the early game lineups right now.
Yeah, I think you guys definitely convinced me that Teemo could be the better version currently.
I'm a big fan of the Teemo over Rearguard, mostly because of just how the meta looks right now. Of like the Endure decks have a plethora of 1-drops that they end up playing on turn 1, depending on which version of the deck. We even see people playing the Warden's Prey and Bark Beast, Hapless Aristocrat. Kind of depends on the deck. And every MF Sejuani player that we've seen actively cheats like 100%. They downloaded the omenhawk.hack.exe file that just puts it in your opening hand every time. I can't even remember the last time I saw an Omen Hawk not dropped on turn 1 in that deck, so
that's how
the Rearguard feels pretty weak. Yeah.
Where's the GitHub link for that? I want to download that.
Yeah, that I definitely missed that download, but
for sure
it's definitely up there on Reddit somewhere, I would imagine.
Yeah, but I think Aggro Burn is solidified itself beyond a shadow of a doubt that it's going to stay at least in A tier. It's not going anywhere. It's too good.
Yeah, it's good on ladder and it's good in tournament. It's just a good deck.
Heavy.
Right.
But yeah, obviously Lobster
Invasion
made this deck.
of the Crustacean.
Oh, we got the dab? All right.
Lobster brought a lot of prominence to this deck after his DRR win. This deck is, I think it's verbatim what he used, right? It's just card for card what he was already playing.
Yes, absolutely. I just love how well-rounded this deck is, and just specific cards that I've been in love with since the beginning of the game. Trofarian Assessor is by far my favorite card in this deck.
That card is
I love that card. Card draw in this.
Reckoning is so nuts in this format too.
It really is. Yeah, I've been in love with Reckoning. Avros and Trapper 2, Glory
Lobster
Seeker.
uses Rhyme Fang. What would you cut in place of Rhyme Fang?
Since we have the myth, the man, the legend himself, right here, you can just ask him. Cut Bjerg?
Mr. Lobster.
I can see you don't need 3 Bjergs, but I like that card a lot.
Right. I think it's a solid card for sure. I like that
Rhyme Fang gives you an answer to some massive units that the deck currently just doesn't have. It seems like something that used 1 Rhyme Fang and 2 Furies. Oh yeah, there's no Fury of the North on this list. That card's broken. Okay,
yeah, that probably is up
minus 3 Bjergs and then plus 2 Furies and 1 Rhyme Fang.
Somebody was kind enough to give me his deck. We can take a look-see at it. So it's playing only 2 Sejuani, 1 Rhyme Fang Wolf, 2 Fury of the North.
3rd Culling Strike was the difference between this one and the last one.
I like the 3 Culling Strike. Maybe that is more of a tournament choice. But we've seen...
You could probably get away with 2 on ladder for the Culling Strikes. I do like the Bjerg consistency.
It is very good versus Heimer.
But yeah, not having Fury of the North from the previous list is like, that card's too good to not be playing. It's kind of my main thought. But I do agree that probably one of the main shortcomings of this list specifically that's solved by the Rhyme Fang Wolf is that there is just no way to kill one giant massive unit other than just freeze it repeatedly until you kill your opponent and just don't worry about it. But that's probably more for like the deep decks is like where you're going to need something like that. Just the behemoths and like the Endure deck. Just when they put something that's so big on the board that you can't really deal with, you just freeze it and Rhyme Fang Wolf it. Good way to catch up on board in the mid game too.
Right.
I also love this Reckoning as a punish, similar to why we see Ruination very popular right now.
Oh yeah, this against like MF Sej, you can just crush them. Same thing with the Endure deck too, unless like they have like Croc or Endure on the board. Everything has 4. So everything just dies. Even against Heimer too, it gives you a really good answer of like that kills Heimerdinger and all of the guys, and Heimerdinger can't buff out of Reckoning range. So
yeah, pretty good card against a lot of the popular strategies.
Especially now that we've cut some denies again, it's just another one of those board wipe cards, and board wipes are like great right now.
And then I'll get to Demacia at the end, but we're moving down to the B tier. This is a deck that we talked about last week a little bit, and this is a deck that BBG is, if you're a fan of him, he's been jamming a lot. The Keg Control deck, he is using Monkey Idol and Gangplank Thresh, Rekindlers, a Dreadway at the top, and then just a strong spell package, the Vile Feast and the Grasp, the Salvage, Triple Vengeance. He's a good man. He knows what's up. Yeah. How do you guys feel about this deck?
I feel
too
like
fair. That's my main thought about it. It's too fair.
Playing with it a little bit, it does some cool things. I can see a good player getting wins with it, but I feel like it is just too fair. There's better decks with better win rates that are doing more unfair things.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. This deck is not doing enough unfair things to be really considered even an A tier deck at this point. Just think about a hand of like Dreadway, Rekindler, Parlay, Vengeance. There's so many hands of incongruity with this deck.
Right.
The main problem with a lot of the Bilgewater cards is that they're not high enough value once you get to the mid to the late game outside of specific ones. Was this BBG's list exactly, or was this a...
Yes, this I actually took this from
I think this was
Mobalytics.
his list.
Because I was going to say, this is different than the one that we had.
Right, this is different than what we were playing. This is the Thresh GP.
Yeah,
right.
I feel like I would just want to find space to put some kind of Riptide Rex package into this deck. I think if I'm playing...
Absolutely.
Come on.
I'd put Riptide Rex in the deck. There's no doubt.
If I'm playing Bilgewater, I'm playing Riptide Rex. That card's the nut.
I think Dreadway is just vastly inferior to that card.
Yeah, that's literally, if I was making a deck with Bilgewater, I think I would actually start by just putting 3 Riptide Rex into my deck. I think that's definitely, BBG took out Riptide Rex for Dreadway. I mean, I would just like to ask him.
He removed it because bad RNG? Did he just like salt and tilt off the
board?
world?
There were like 7 units on the board, and he just 7 targeted the same card once. It was just like, that's it, Alt F4.
Or he didn't have like an activator.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, well... Yeah, I would definitely be playing some amount of
this deck is
Riptide
clearly
Rex
trying to get away from plunder cards, and I could see how that's frustrating sometimes if you don't have an activator. But I think just the potential of those cards is too great to play a deck like this that's going to get beat more times than not by that.
Right.
PBG is that guy that takes 0 risk. I mean, that's often a sign of a better player, is like trying to just mitigate your RNG to as close to 0
Mitigating your RNG is very important.
And then we're just gonna...
Riptide Rex is kind of just always broken, though. I don't know if I...
Alright, since we're talking... We got BBJ's name in our mouth. Let's talk about his Lux Karma deck. Clearly this deck fell off a cliff following nerfs to 25% of the deck. It doesn't seem like that, but when you're playing 3 Deep Meds, you're playing 3 Badger Bears, Grizzled Ranger, and Karmas, that's a whole lot of your deck.
Yep.
We've just seen how these stat adjustments have just really made this deck not good enough to contend with other decks right now. And the deck already was having a hard time in certain matchups like Heimerdinger, and now Heimerdinger has come out as the best deck in the format, overwhelmingly. And this deck just is a man without a home. This deck does not have anywhere to really be right now.
I feel like it's still pretty good against the Endure deck with the 1 Unyielding Spirit in it, for sure, and just having like that in Radiant Guardian and a lot of answers for the Atrocity play. But like even then, like they can still kind of just get steamrolled out of the early game. The Grizzled Ranger and the Badger Bear not having 4 attack is actually just so crucial to how this deck managed to answer everything through the early and mid game. That arguably was a much bigger nerf to the deck than anything. The Karma and the Deep Meditation were certainly nerfs, but I think just losing the capability to easily answer cards with 4 HP was just a huge loss for the deck. Also being able to apply just a lot more pressure to force your opponent to feel like they're obligated to trade into these things, giving you more value. But yeah, not being able to like trade into something like the Cursed Keeper 4/4 that pops out is just really rough for a deck like this in the early game. Something that felt like such an easy matchup before is just a lot worse now.
Yeah, I think a lot of this deck's ability to address the board, especially the early game, was predicated on Badger Bear and Grizzled Ranger, whether it was just straight combat, whether it was single combats, or just everything about this deck. The reason this deck worked was because you took this very strong Ionia value package and answers with the Deny and the Will, and then you just combined it with a strong unit package with Badger Bear, Grizzled Ranger, and Radiant Guardian, and now this deck, it just doesn't work.
Yeah, I don't think that this deck is. I mean, it might still be B tier. I'm fine with it being in B tier, but yeah, I mean, I just am not a fan of what it's doing anymore. I think it's just slowed down too much in too many areas that it's just not really. You could be playing better things again. It's more fair now, and
yeah.
Right.
Also, the decks it farmed are also kind of gone. That's
Right.
another big part of it. Of like, it was farming Karina Control before.
Right.
That's not, nobody plays that deck anymore. Which
Right.
we
Everybody
have
was
been
playing
saying that
Burn.
hopefully people will start
Yeah.
playing that deck again. So that's definitely a big part of it. But yeah, this deck just destroyed that deck for the most part. For so many reasons.
Triangle format, right, where it was like Burn was so prevalent, and then Karina was farming the Burn, and then this came out to farm Karina, and then
Also
Heimer was just
Demacia,
like
too.
sitting everywhere. Yeah, Demacia and Heimer were in there just crushing.
Right.
Right,
But
the
like, I think this deck
fire.
was much better against the Demacia decks, which also are
right
not really
not
being
here.
played as much anymore.
Do
also, you
think
don't
there's
answer them as well with the lowered Badger Bear and Grizzled Ranger versus the Bannerman boards for sure. Becomes a lot harder to kill the cards once you're with your one less attack, and like Cythria boards too and things like that.
I think
So,
we
do
do
you
need
think there's a
an
way to
unyielding spirit
repurpose
on
this
this
deck?
list.
Do you think that there is like a way to give this deck a fresh coat of paint or a retooling, another package to be added? Do you think there's potential here?
Maybe. I mean, perhaps it's just that no one's really been trying it too much, just much like the Karina list, and we've just been kind of playing what's left for this patch. Maybe there is some retooling that could be done. I'm not really sure what. Like I said, I would want to see an Unyielding Spirit. I think Unyielding Spirit on Radiant Guardian is just such a game-ending combo most of the time for a lot of
definitely
matchups.
one of the best parts about the deck was to just play the Unyielding Spirit for
That
sure.
is what I was thinking, that this deck could be like you could retool this as a hard answer to Shadow Isles Endure.
Right. And just the Karina deck as well by default.
Right.
It just feels like it was so much better before at dealing with a deck like that because the Badger Bear and the Grizzly Ranger had 4 attack, and now that they don't, it's like there's so many things in that deck that they no longer kill or even pose enough of a damaging threat that like they care if these cards are hitting you. Like they can block the Grizzled Ranger for free most of the time, and then you just have a 3/4 and they're just like, cool, I don't care. My cards are just so much bigger. But they do like this deck does still have a lot of good ways to beat the Endure deck. Outside of that, I would say that's just like the main shortcoming of like Will, Deny, Unyielding Spirit on a lifesteal card is definitely just enough to crush that deck a lot of the time. But
do we ever just retool it to be like more of an elusive deck, like we play Solitary Monks, things like that, and then we're just karmaing or luxing them out of the game?
It kind of just feels like the problem with the deck is it does everything that other decks have to offer worse for the capability to do a wider variety of things, but it's kind of like the jack of all trades, master of none. Just there are other decks that are better ways to utilize the Ionia cards. There are other decks that are better ways to utilize the Demacia package, either as like the mid game, like early aggressive things. There's better Unyielding Spirit decks, this being one of them, I would say. Like it's just kind of hard to say, but I think it's like it's still good enough to play the deck. It just it's not broken anymore. It just doesn't do anything overwhelmingly well, and it doesn't seem to just like farm any current matchup. It's just too much happened to the deck in terms of mana increase and stat reduction. Was having 12 out of 40 of your cards that you are definitely still going to play in the deck.
So as long as we're shitting on Demacia, we might as well just bring up the rear here with Fiora Garen. Still the same old deck. Some people ask us whether or not like a scout, MF scouts is better. Quinn is just way too weak. A 3/4/5 mana does not cut it for me. Doesn't cut it for any deck, I don't think. But still a solid line. If you just go 1, 2, 3 into Bannerman every game, you'll probably still win a good amount of games. But the edge that the decks, the hands where you didn't get that, where Badger Bear or Grizzled Ranger was just good enough from raw stats, that's not there anymore. These cards are just too, not weak, but they, you see that you would just win by a few points of damage before, and these reductions to both prominent cards just made the games a little bit out of reach. Do you
I think
think that
Demacia
there
decks
is
definitely need to start getting. I think that a lot of them have started playing a lot more riposts in the main as well. It's just a really good card in this format, I feel like, because it allows you to trade up on so many things, and there's just not a lot of it. Combat tricks just feel like the name of the game right now, and so that feels like a really strong one for them that just allows them to completely eat at a unit and just, come out unscathed out of these combats. And
I
then they
would
already
probably
have
like to
single
see this
combat.
deck go balls to the wall in terms of like a new approach. Just forget the top end for the most part and just repost and maybe some other early game tools, and or even you could repurpose it. Somebody suggested before you go very much into the Garen Fuhrer Unyielding Spirits more so, and you just really want to crush Shadow Isles.
Right.
But yeah, just what it did before, it doesn't do well enough, and it has to find a new way to be unfair, as we say a lot. It's just like your deck has to be unfair, and this deck is really, it has unfair plays, they're just inconsistent.
It's way too linear. That's the main problem with Mono Demacia right now. So like it used to be fine that this deck was so linear and had very few decisions to be made to like allow you to outplay your opponent and like combat a wide variety of responses because of just the pure stats of everything of like how powerful Badger Bear and Grizzled Ranger were and how much they could just carry you through the game, as well as the decks that we were seeing at the time. But now it's just like basically the advantage that you have by playing this over a similar deck, I think, is like MF Sejuani of just like the other aggro deck, is that in that matchup specifically, your cards are well statted enough to actually combat what you're going against, but not even all the time. Like there's still just a lot of things that deck can do, like with Omen Hawk, as well as like a buff Jagged Butcher in the early game, and then they just start contesting everything that you're doing and Misfortune and things like that through the game. And the decks are playing Razor Scale Hunter now, and Riptide Rex at the top end is just so much better than a top end in your deck. It's like I feel like you might have a slight edge there, but like you lose out so much on all those other matchups that it just wouldn't make any sense for you to play a deck like this over a deck like that. Like the capability of all that additional draw power, the damaging capability to stop value trades, the top end of Riptide Rex, cards like Fury of the North, Sejuani is an answer to a lot of popular. There's just like there's so much more. There's so many more dimensions to a deck like that, and how it covers all of the shortcomings of the typical aggro deck, that this deck just doesn't do anything really to cover those holes. It's just, I'm really big. All of my cards are statted highly enough that if I curve, that should naturally just be a problem enough to carry me through any, opposition. And when it doesn't, and I can't do anything about it. There's like no fail safe. There's no, like, the deck is just too linear and can't really adapt to problematic situations in certain games. It's just like I just curve and either it gets there or it doesn't. That's really all you can do.
Right, and with that linear play, it just it relied a lot around those huge stats, and it doesn't have it. Just like a little bit took it away. Do you think that there is like a version that maybe we haven't seen yet that could be repurposed for the current format, or do you think we'll just have to see either new cards or buffs, nerfs come out?
I like the Freljord versions of the deck a lot, and I not that many people have been playing them. I also like Lucian a lot right now, like Lucian Fiora, Lucian Sejuani, Lucian Vi. I just think Lucian and Senna are just the new like early game way to play this deck. I think curving those cards together is like kind of like Exodia in a lot of matchups. It's just it's
hard, yeah.
So fucking strong.
Yeah, that's what I was definitely thinking when I meant like low to the ground. I was thinking Lucian, I was thinking Senna. Just like these, you have to make something unfair, and Lucian Senna, that's unfair.
Yes, absolutely. Could not agree more. Of that is just such a powerful combination, especially right now too, of just how strong Quick Attack is. against decks like MF Sejuani, even the Endure deck too, of like how powerful Lucian Senna can be against that deck. Of Lucian is fine on 2 unless they have exactly, you know, the Butcher into the 4/4, and then Senna answers that. That's a big one, is that Senna can actually attack into the Endure deck, and that's one of their best ways to beat the aggro decks right now, and why Endure is doing so well, of having that early game strategy of summon an early 4/4, beat the aggro decks, and then against the control decks, play a behemoth that's hard to kill, and then when they do, shoot it at their face. It's pretty straightforward, just like simple game plan in the early game, simple solution in the late game for when you last that long. So I think that you can put a stop to the early game answers by having cards with 4 attack. It's one of the another big reason why this deck doesn't feel like it's doing very well right now. In the mono Demacia, you can't beat 4/4s, and Endure's just so popular. You know, it's pretty hard. So
yeah, this deck definitely needs to get a change in its direction, either the Lucian, or I could see a Fiora center deck, as we've seen more in tournament
more of
format.
a fan of those, the standalone Fiora,
Right.
Freljord lists. I'm thinking those are definitely creeping into potential B tier territory in the current format.
Right.
I feel like,
if they're not already, they probably already are.
I was gonna say, yeah, they're definitely already in B tier. I think they're pushing towards A tier. It's just like I don't know what the refined list is, and I feel like they definitely do much better in tournament to targeting specific things, the unyielding spirit decks, but definitely decks like that are like they do something broken, and that is a way to, you know, push it into the A tier.
Right.
There's just a very broken interaction, and Fiora's all right now, but you just need the proper line of buffs behind her. I feel like she doesn't do that well without all of the powerful buff spells, just because of how many good combat tricks there are right now. Fury of the North being a huge one that's just so prevalent in all of the best decks. So,
and I almost forgot about this. Is our actual. I debated everybody. This is our actual final deck. Is TF Swain. We seen the deck start with the very popular Twitch rivals. Dog played a very different version of this deck, but still doing similar things. He was on the right track. He had like some of the pilfer cards, but not all of them. He didn't. I guess he just didn't want to shit on everybody, trying to have a good day. But I think that's definitely the way to go with the unholy trinity of Black Market Merchant, Pilfered Goods, and Yordle Grifter at 3. Also, he wasn't playing Riptide Rex, or if he was, it was only a single copy. I'm going back and forth whether or not it's 3 and 1 Leviathan or 2 and 2, but I think Riptide Rex is clearly the better card in most cases, but I do like Leviathan. Prior to the set even coming out, we were huge fans of this card, and I think this is one of the best applications for this. And then Ravenous Flock is a card that I was actually pretty soured on. I thought this card would be too hard to activate, but as we see in a deck like this, it's just a really good, efficient way to kill things. Culling Strike works great in this deck. And then it just has a good amount of burn also. The Fervor, the Death's Hand, the Leviathan. But still, this deck is not like... this is not a world beater. This isn't a hard counter, so we see it still in this B tier.
Right.
Any thoughts?
Good way to combine these elements in a tournament format, and it also is a pretty strong deck. It's just another one of those things that I don't want to call it a fair deck, just because I don't ever want to call a Pilfered Goods deck a fair deck, but it's just, it doesn't really line up well with what everything is. Yeah, I mean, it is just kind of, it's just kind of fair. There's much better ways to be abusing what Bilgewater's doing in this format.
I think the way to go with Swain right now is probably Shadow Isles. Personally, I really just like where a lot of the Shadow Isles control cards are lining up with the current format of Ruination and Vengeance, and I think it's a pretty good way to utilize it. The problem with that deck is winning the game, and Rekindler seems like a good way to maybe go about that, like Leviathan, Swain. Like, they have some pretty good top end, but like I feel like that's just a strong answer to Heimerdinger right now, and maybe we'll see that in the future. Maybe something we could test out with Yasuo Swain. We've seen plenty of before. Probably also, I can't really tell if it's better than this deck or not, because like Yasuo is just a little bit too much of the one trick pony of like, if you don't get the Yasuo, your deck is pretty mediocre. the
Oh,
unfortunate
I would
part.
take it a step
It's
farther. Your deck is doing nothing if you don't have the Yasuo. The whole deck's value is predicated
yeah.
on Yasuo.
So like this deck is a fair deck, and the reason why it's in B tier is like if you're looking at let's say fair is the par, like and that's the whatever you want to put it at, that's a 1. And a broken deck in A tier is moving into the like 1.2 power level, and the S tier decks are even pushing up that, and it's like 1.3, 1.4, above the curve of fair. And a deck like Yasuo is like, without Yasuo is like below a 1. It's at like a 0.8 by comparison to 1 being like a perfectly fair deck. And then when you get Yasuo, it kind of just pushes into maybe like an A tier deck, and I just don't think it's consistent enough. Like bottom of A tier, it's very it seems like too flimsy of a strategy. When it works, though, it's very powerful, and against specific matchups, it's pretty good. But the way the current meta is, I don't think it even lines up that well. But